So if you're watching or you've done any of the phase 1 work, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, these guys are just constantly bashing yoga and Pilates, and that is not the case at all. But we need to establish that there are challenges that those of you that have done these exercises prior to back pain or partially prior to and then during back pain as a means of trying to relieve the back pain, you fall into some of these same traps, and that can affect you early on in phase 1. And there are a number of little bits that we're going to talk about in this video that will hopefully really help you get more out of phase 1 and also know actually there's a very, very good chance that you really should have already moved into phase 2, especially if you're up and about. And we'll explain a little bit more about why that is in this video and much more in other videos too. The big problem when it comes to back pain is that there is a lot of tightness. There's feelings of tightness because those muscles are hanging in. And this really goes to the root of the problem, that people assume that tightness needs stretching, and that's not always the case. And in a lot of cases of back pain, there's too much focus on stretching and not enough on strengthening. Tight muscles don't always need to be stretched. Sometimes they need to be strengthened so that they are exerting less capacity of effort. They need to put less effort in to hold the body steady. For example, if you have a nice big car, big engine car pulling a trailer, it's going to need to work a lot less hard than if you have a little tiny engine on a moped trying to pull the same load. It's very clear when we understand that, but one is going to be screaming at you tight and the other one is going to effortlessly pull that load. And that is the big thing when it comes to tightness. Tightness is often those muscles are just too weak, and the only thing they can do to stop themselves being hurt is just, I'm not moving anymore. And that feels to you as tightness, so we think immediately stretch it, and that is wrong. So hopefully that got the first bit out of the way, is if you are moving around and you're just doing these sorts of exercises, we need to get on to phase 2. That's where strengthening comes in, and that is really important. But we're not going to digress or go down that rabbit hole in this particular video. There's plenty of others for that. The thing we wanted to really touch on in this video is that being someone that's maybe a little bit more flexible, you might struggle to feel some of these stretches. You might feel that you get into a bit of discomfort when you're doing some of the stretches, and you might be thinking, hold on a second, why in phase 1 am I doing these stretches when you've just said to do strengthening work instead? That's a bit of a contradiction, is it not? You would be right to ask that question. So hopefully the next 3 points are really going to help you better understand why that might be the case, and hopefully just clear up that little contradiction for you. A lot of people learn to naturally move very fluidly, especially if we've done yoga and Pilates and those sorts of activities. And that fluid motion is great for us normally, but when we have an injury and we have an injured structure, we need to start being a little bit more specific about that movement, about being able to pass out movement in the hip and movement in the lower back. And a lot of times you'll see it all the time. People go down and do a classic touch your toes hamstring stretch, which you've probably done thousands of times or seen people do thousands of times in a yoga class or Pilates. You go all the way down and everything moves fluidly. There are those exercises where you lie on your back in a bridge position and you slowly just lower all those joints down to touch the floor, one spinal joint at a time, just flowing them all down. So they're all moving in one nice flowy movement. And that's great, but it's not learning to discern that hip from lumbar spine movement. And that is one of the big things we need to start to add in. And that's where phase 1 can do that really helpfully. You may not need to really push those hamstring stretches. And in the early stages of back pain, doing those hip mobility exercises in phase 1, you don't need to push them. We're just trying to keep things mobile. We're not trying to improve flexibility, increase flexibility. We're trying to keep it mobile. And there are all sorts of reasons why that's fundamentally a waste of time to try and objectively improve your flexibility at this stage. We're just trying to keep things mobile. But if you are someone that is a little bit more flexible, spend this time working in a very, very safe manner on actually just moving the hip through into extension when we're doing the hip flexor stretch without the back moving. We'll touch more on the issues with that later. Or when you're doing your hamstring stretch, learn to actually pivot just from the hip alone whilst the back does not move. Because when you do a hamstring stretch and you lean forwards to stretch forwards, it's the hamstring pulling on the lower back as you round forwards. That's the problem. Sorry about that one, folks. That is the weather here in Britain. It suddenly changes to very, very sunny quickly and then going back to lovely and grey. Now let's get back into it. So if you are typically doing those fluid motions, what's going to be happening is the hip is going to be bending, but as the hip's bending, the spine is also bending here. And if those habits are set in for long periods of time prior to you having this back injury, now you're learning these back in shape exercises, maybe you're a little bit more flexible in the hamstrings. Take the time to start learning in your phase 1. You're not bringing that hip or that hip through the complete flexion, but you're taking the time to learn to bend only this hip here and not bend this lumbar spine where we've got the injury. That is real key for you. And then you will do an awful lot better going forwards, because you're going to then eventually be adding in exercises in phase 2. You're going to be adding in other movements where we equally need to keep the hip discrete from the lower back when it comes to movement. But doing this in a simple stretch is by far the safest possible way you could do this, and it's the better way to get a more effective stretch on the target muscles. So you're going to be more effective with your stretching in the long term by learning these skills as well. So you've kind of covered the next point, which is kind of just go through the motions. If you are really flexible, you're struggling to feel it, just go through the motions and feel that the hip is the only thing moving. Focus on holding that lumbar spine together, still, static, supported, so that it is not moving and only the hips are, because this will pay dividends in phase 2 in the strengthening component. And as you get into phase 2, you're still going to be doing phase 1 exercises anyway, so we should be continuing to practice this movement so we get really good at it, isolating the hip from the lower back in movement. We can feed it back in later on, and we will, but for the time being, the stage of recovery that you're in, this is very important. We'll close this video out with why this is important, because quite often when we are very flexible, these fluid motions affect us, and people will message, they'll say, hey, I did that stretch in phase 1 and my back was tweaking, or my back was tweaking when I was doing the hamstring one, or whatever it may be, but it's tweaking in the spine. And the reason it is tweaking in the spine, the reason it is slightly aggravating those symptoms at the time, is because the back is getting involved in the movement. If you can practice this, maybe you aren't stiff as a board, you can touch those toes, or you have been able to, you know you've got that flexibility, that I don't need more stretching, and they've said I need to do strengthening anyway. Use this as an opportunity to practice your technique, because that will help you consciously start to develop better control over your core and over your hip muscles and the way in which they move, so that movements can be focused through these strong hip muscles, the strong hip joint, so your back has the respite it needs over the coming weeks and months to go through a recovery process while being held in the best possible position for it to recover. And later on, of course, we can go into other sorts of activities when the time comes that challenge the spine in different ways. That's it for now. Hopefully you found this video helpful. It is a bit of a rambling one, and for some of you guys, you won't necessarily need it. But if you are a little bit more flexible, you've got a history of doing exercises, stretches, feeling that tightness and just wanting to stretch it out, and you've got too much flexibility, make the step and start your strengthening work. But don't neglect these exercises. Use them as that practice point, that safe, very safe for the lower back practice point, to learn how to move that hip independent of the lumbar spine. It will make your recovery so much more effective, so much smoother, and you'll also have a tool, a skill set that will keep your back in shape for a very long period to come. And it will also pay dividends when you're in some of the more advanced strengthening exercises of phases 3, 4, and beyond. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about the premium Back in Shape membership, there's going to be a video somewhere underneath here. And if you want to stay up to date or tune into some of our more recent live streams and the Q&As at the end of those, then that's going to be down here. And remember, you can subscribe to the channel up here and hit the notification bell to make sure you know when we next go live, so you can join us for our next live stream and Q&A.